My name is Eliza. I am 40 years old, and for most of my life, people only saw me as the poor woman from the old cottage near the river. They never knew my story. They never knew how many nights I cried quietly so no one would hear me. But sometimes, God writes the most beautiful endings for the people the world forgets. I lived in a tiny village surrounded by hills and forests. My husband had passed away many years earlier, leaving me alone with my little son Daniel. Life was never easy after that. Every morning before sunrise, I carried baskets of bread through the village streets, selling them door to door just to survive. Some people were kind. Others looked at me with pity. But there was one woman who treated me as if I was nothing. Her name was Mrs. Victoria. She was the richest woman in the village, owner of the largest house anyone had ever seen. Tall iron gates surrounded her mansion, and servants followed her everywhere. She wore expensive dresses, sparkling jewelry, and perfumes so strong people noticed her before she even spoke. One rainy morning, I knocked on her door to deliver fresh bread. When she opened the door, she looked at my wet clothes with disgust. "You're dripping water all over my floor," she snapped. "I'm sorry, ma'am," I said quietly. The rain became very strong. She grabbed the basket from my hands and threw 2 coins toward me. "Poor people always bring problems," she muttered before slamming the door. I picked up the coins silently from the muddy ground. My son was hungry, and I had no choice but to endure humiliation. That night, Daniel noticed tears in my eyes while I sat near the fireplace. "Mom," he whispered softly, "why are people mean to us?" I hugged him tightly and kissed his forehead. "Because some people have money in their pockets, but emptiness in their hearts," I replied gently. "But never let bitterness grow inside you." The next morning, life changed unexpectedly. As I walked near the forest road carrying bread, I heard a weak cry coming from the bushes. At first I thought it was an animal, but when I moved the branches aside, I gasped. An old man lay on the ground, injured and trembling from cold. His clothes were dusty, and one of his legs was bleeding badly. "Please," he whispered, "help me." Without hesitation, I carried him slowly to my cottage. I cleaned his wounds, gave him warm soup, and let him sleep in my own bed, while Daniel and I rested near the fireplace. For 3 days, I cared for him. He rarely spoke, but his eyes were gentle and grateful. On the 4th morning, he finally smiled. "You helped me without asking who I was," he said quietly. I laughed softly. "A hungry person needs food before questions." The old man looked at me carefully for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and handed me a small silver key. "Tomorrow," he said, "go to the old mill near the river at sunrise. Use this key." Before I could ask anything else, he stood up and left. I never saw him again. The next morning, curiosity filled my heart. I took Daniel's hand, and together we walked to the abandoned mill beside the river. The place looked forgotten for years. My hands trembled as I inserted the silver key into an old wooden door. Click. The door slowly opened. Inside, hidden beneath dusty cloths and old boxes, were dozens of wooden chests filled with gold coins, documents, and jewels. I froze in shock. Daniel stared at me with wide eyes. "Mom, are we rich?" Tears filled my eyes instantly. But beside the treasure was a letter. It read, "To the woman with the kindest heart. I was once the owner of great wealth, but I spent my life surrounded by selfish people who only loved my money. When I was injured and helpless, you cared for me without expecting anything in return. This treasure now belongs to you. Use it wisely, help those who suffer, and never lose the kindness that makes you truly rich." I held the letter against my chest and cried. For the first time in years, they were not tears of pain. They were tears of hope. Over the following months, my life transformed completely. I repaired our small cottage and turned it into a warm, beautiful home. I opened a bakery in the village and hired poor widows who needed work. No hungry child was ever turned away from my door again. People who once ignored me now greeted me with respect. But I never forgot where I came from. One afternoon, while serving bread in the bakery, the bell above the door rang softly. I looked up and saw Mrs. Victoria standing there, but she no longer looked proud. Her expensive clothes were gone, and sadness filled her eyes. "I lost everything," she admitted quietly. "My business failed. My servants left. Nobody stayed beside me." For a moment, silence filled the bakery. Then, She lowered her head. I treated you terribly, Eliza. I was cruel because I believed wealth made me better than others. I was wrong. I looked at the tired woman standing before me, and despite everything she had done, my heart felt compassion. I handed her a warm loaf of bread and smiled gently. Sit down, I said softly. You look hungry. Her eyes filled with tears. Why are you helping me after everything? I glanced toward my son, who was laughing happily behind the counter. Because kindness given only to good people is not true kindness. Mrs. Victoria began to cry quietly. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, I stood outside my bakery and watched the golden light cover the village streets. Years earlier, I had been a poor widow, carrying bread through rain and humiliation. Now I had peace, purpose, and a home filled with love. I closed my eyes and whispered softly to the evening sky, "Thank you, Lord, for teaching me that the richest heart is not the one filled with gold, but the one filled with kindness."